Sometimes the road signs lie. A few weeks ago, my wife and I went on a road trip for a family reunion in El Paso, Texas. I am now sitting in the hospital waiting room, desperately wishing we hadn't. "How much longer?" Melanie asked, leaning her seat back and putting her hand into the small of her back in a feeble attempt to find a more comfortable position. "Google says we've got a few more hours to go," I said, glancing quickly at my phone sitting in the cup holder, then putting my eyes back to the road. "Do we need to stop again?" Melanie shifted in her seat a bit, removed her hand from behind her, then sat it back up to its original vertical position. At 7 months pregnant, her options for comfort were quickly dwindling, and none of them involved the front seat of a car. "No, let's just go. If we stop again, I'm not going to want to get back into the car." "Signal lost," my phone's robotic female voice announced. "God damn it," I sighed. The phone had been doing that for the past couple of hours at increasing intervals. There had apparently been an accident or something on the main highway which would have backed us up by at least an hour, according to the all-knowing Google. In order to avoid that, we'd taken a detour that snaked around the accident through the desert on a 2-lane highway. That had been 3 hours ago, maybe more. It was hard to keep track of when it happened because even before the phone had alerted us of the accident, the whole trip had been little more than a palette of browns and greys, broken up only by the regular bathroom break. As I saw it, the New Mexico desert was the skid mark on the underpants of America, and if I never had the pleasure of driving through it again, it would be too soon. The sun had set about an hour ago, not long before the signal started getting more spotty, and the highway hypnosis had really started to get to me. There was nothing but desert on either side of us, and even with the high beams on, the darkness covered us like a thick blanket. "Got any more Red Bull?" I asked. "If we're going to go for a few more hours, I need some wings." Melanie reached into the back seat for a second, grunting with discomfort, then returned with a can of Red Bull. "Last one," she said. "This was sitting on the seat, so the sun warmed it up for you." "Great," I said, taking the can, cracking the seal, and swallowing 3 large gulps. "This will sit well with all the other junk I've been eating for the past 2 days." Without a baby on the way, Mel and I could have driven the stretch between Bozeman and El Paso in 2 days without a problem. But with her being as pregnant as she was, we had to carve out almost double the time, and she was still miserable. I let out a burp that tasted like all the atrocious snacks and truck stop food from that day, mixed with the warm energy drink I was layering on top, and solemnly promised myself I would eat nothing but salad and water for the rest of my life. "Turn left here for the Church of Christ." "I thought the Church of Christ was back there," Mel said, reading the dilapidated sign as we passed it. "No, that was the Church of Jesus Christ," I said. "Big difference, apparently." All through the drive, we'd seen a wide variety of local churches, mostly generic, but after passing one called the Church of Liberty over a backdrop of a poorly drawn Confederate flag, we had turned it into a sort of game to see who could find the most outlandish one. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the hum of the engine and the intermittent signal loss notification from my phone. I had looked at the phone earlier when the signal was stronger and saw that we just needed to go to the end of this road, turn right, and we'd find ourselves getting back onto the freeway. So although the intermittent announcement from the cup holder was annoying, I wasn't particularly concerned. That was until we saw a sign that said, "Freeway entrance, left, 1 mile." "I thought you said it was a right at the end of the road," Melanie said, sitting up and grabbing the phone. "That's what it said," I insisted. "I checked it last time we had service like half an hour ago. We had about 60 or so miles to go, and then it was a right." "How sure are you?" she asked, putting the phone back into the cup holder. Because your phone is still saying it has no service, so it's not going to be any help. Pretty damn, I said. Just then we passed another sign. Freeway entrance, left, 0.5 mile. At least, I think so. I think we should follow the signs, Mel said. I don't want to get lost out here, and the phone hasn't had consistent service in a while. It could have reset and changed routes or something to have us avoid the highway. Remember last time? I did remember last time. A Vegas trip that ended up being 4 hours longer than it should have been because my phone reset and had us taking frontage roads and city streets. It would have been longer had Mel not thought to check the route on her phone. I was sure that I had seen it was taking us back to the highway, and that the next turn was a right in about 30 minutes or so, given our current speed, but with the evidence to the contrary quickly approaching me in the darkness, illuminated by my headlights, I made the single most critical mistake that I would regret for the rest of my life. I followed the street sign and turned left. Mel leaned back in her seat, embarking again on her quest for a comfortable position, and I continued to stare at the lines in the road as we passed. Time begins to lose meaning when you've been on the road in the dark for as long as we were that night. It could have been hours that we spent speeding straight down the desert road, or it could have been days. With no focal point, it was really up to the clock alone to tell us how long we'd been there. And the clock on the dashboard had inexplicably reset at some point, something it did on occasion for most of the time I'd owned the car. Another bullet for Melanie to fire at me whenever we got into our marital spats. I didn't care, and she really didn't either, but it was another straw to load up on the camel's back nonetheless. My faith in the phone had begun to waver even further, as I was becoming sure even that clock was running slow somehow. We'd go for 5 or 6 miles according to the odometer, and the clock would read only a minute or two had passed. I drained the last bit of Red Bull down my throat, again promising myself nothing but clean eating after this trip was over. Moments later, I felt a dull pressure in my bowels. The last drop of liquid must have been the last straw for my bladder. Mel slept quietly next to me, having finally crashed a while back, and I made the second decision I would come to regret. Although we hadn't seen another car for miles, I flipped my hazard lights on and pulled over to the side of the road. I turned off the car and stepped out of the car and relieved myself, relishing one of the finer points of being a man, and having the ability to take a leak in the middle of the road without much fanfare and return to the car. Mel stirred then and asked if we were there yet. Not yet, just a bit further. Had to take a leak. She rolled her eyes and closed them again. I turned the key to start the car back up and heard a sound that sunk my heart into my stomach. Click, 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 click. Oh shit, I said under my breath. Please don't do this. I turned the key again and once more heard the series of clicks telling me that my car didn't have enough power to start back up. Fuck, I sighed, resting my head against the steering wheel in defeat. What's wrong? Mel asked, opening one eye. Battery's dead. What? There was a hint of panic in her voice and she sat back up, totally awake now. But the car was just running. Yeah, it was running off of the alternator. The battery needs just enough power to start, then the car can run off of the power generated by the alternator. All we need is a jump, and we should be able to get the rest of the way, as long as we don't turn the car off. But who's going to jump us? Mel asked. When was the last time you saw a car? It's been a while, I admitted. Definitely not since we made that turn back there. Fuck, Mel spat. Fuck, fuck, fuck. Stay here, I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. Where are you going? She asked, the panic in her voice rising. Just up there, I said, pointing down the road. I think I see a sign, maybe 100 yards out there. It might give us an idea of which direction we need to go, or if we need to just wait until the sun comes up. I could tell she didn't like it, but she didn't say anything. I'll keep my flashlight on so you can see where I am. I'll just go there, then straight back. She nodded. Unless I see a Denny's, then you're on your own. She flipped me off, I kissed her cheek, and stepped out into the night. The air was brisk, despite having been downright hot during the day, and I remembered learning in science class as a kid that desert wildlife had to be tough enough to endure not only the heat during the day, but the cold, sometimes freezing temperatures at night as well. I shivered and hugged my arms around my torso and made my way down the road to where I thought I'd seen a road sign. As I approached, I realized it wasn't the kind of sign I was hoping for. It was made of cracked wood that looked just a little better than the sign for the church we'd seen a while back, and on it, painted in white letters, it read, Gompa's Farm, above a crudely drawn arrow pointing down a dirt path to the right. My gaze followed the arrow, and I thought I could see a light far off in the distance. A scream broke through the darkness that turned my blood to ice. Mel, I called, wheeling around and bolting back the way I came. Melanie! I could see the shape of the car in the distance, but it was too far away for my flashlight to do much good. I sprinted down the road, screaming my wife's name in a hot panic. What? Melanie called back, alarmed. I slowed when I heard her voice and held the light up again. She was standing on the passenger side of the car with the door open. I thought I heard you screaming, I said through heaving breaths. She looked around, confused. No? You didn't hear that? I asked. She shook her head. No, I don't think so. I was in the car until I heard you yelling, though. Where did it come from? I don't know, I said, shaking my head and spitting the bitter flavor of adrenaline into the dirt. Maybe it was an animal or something, she suggested. What did the sign say? There's a farmhouse or something about a mile down the road, I think, I explained. It's not exactly ideal, but if I jog it, I could make it in about 10 minutes or so. If anyone's there, all they'd have to do is give me a ride back and help us jump the car. If nobody's there, we'll probably have to wait till morning unless a car happens to pass by. She mulled it over for a moment, then I saw the resolve on her face and I knew what was coming next. I'm going with you then. I didn't like it, but I could tell that arguing wasn't going to get me anywhere but the doghouse, and considering the scream I heard, or thought I heard anyway, I preferred having her close. Fine, I agreed. Grab your jacket though. I'm gonna grab mine and a couple of water bottles from the back. A moment later, we were hiking down the road, our silhouettes illuminated intermittently by the orange hazard lights we'd elected to leave on. I doubted the battery would last if those lights were on too long, but if someone was driving past, I would hate for them to miss it. Mel had thought to leave a note on the windshield telling whomever found it that we'd gone to the farmhouse and would be back shortly. If anyone was kind enough to stop, they'd hopefully see the letter and stick around long enough to help. That, or they'd know where to look for us coming back so they could take whatever they wanted out of the car before we returned. There was a cool breeze that played with our hair as we walked. Not uncomfortable, but enough to make me zip my jacket up just a bit more. Mel held the only flashlight we had, and the beam bounced up and down in the darkness like a boy. The car was barely visible when Mel shrieked so suddenly I nearly tripped on my own foot. What? I asked, suddenly panicked. Look, she said, extending her fingers past the head of the flashlight. What? It's gone now. You didn't see it? No, I was too busy asking myself why I'm hiking with a pregnant banshee. There's something out there, she said, ignoring my jab. Just past that rock, I saw a pair of golden eyes. Probably a coyote, I said, starting to walk again. They're cowards. If we keep walking and talking, nothing should bug us, especially if we stick to the road here. Mel nodded, then caught up to me. How much longer do you think it'll be till we get to the farm? Dunno, I shrugged. 10 or 15 minutes, maybe? Just then, I saw the eyes she was talking about. Out in the distance, next to a large boulder on the side of the road, sat a pair of curious golden eyes. Definitely a coyote, I said, pointing at it. You can see its shape a bit, all fours, low to the ground. It looks like it might be a little bit bigger than the ones I've seen, but there's not much else out here that looks like that. That's probably what I heard earlier too, one of these guys catching a rabbit or something. I wasn't sure I believed it, but it felt good to get some sort of explanation on the record. We kept talking as we walked down the path, closer to the eyes, and when they disappeared, I was a bit disappointed, but not surprised. Part of me wanted to see the coyote up close, but if we got close enough to see it, that probably meant we were close to a den, which is the last place we'd want to find ourselves. We talked about what we'd do when we finally got home, and how soon we'd find ourselves laughing about the whole ordeal, when Mel stopped suddenly in the middle of the road. Shit. What is it now? I asked, looking around for another pair of eyes. I have to pee. No chance you can hold it? I asked, holding back a chuckle at the poor timing. Not unless you can go talk this kid out of using my bladder as a waterbed, she replied, handing me the flashlight. Where should I go? Why not right here? You kidding? Not even a little bit, I said. You probably shouldn't wander too far off the trail, and it's not like anyone's around to see you anyway. Hell, if someone showed up and the universe decided now was the time to embarrass you, I still take that over the rest of the walk. Fine, she sighed, pulling her maternity pants down and squatting. As she did her business, I took the opportunity to scan the surroundings with the flashlight. I found a few more pairs of golden eyes on either side of the road, which quickened my pulse just a little. I didn't like being outnumbered, and I liked being surrounded even less. Melanie finished her business, and with some assistance from me to get back up to a vertical position, we were off again, our feet crunching against the dirt as we walked. I thought I heard something then, and this time it was my turn to stop. What? Mel asked. Shush, I said. I started again, then stopped. What is it? Mel whispered. Another scream? Nothing, I lied, picking the pace back up. Thought I heard a car. We walked again in silence, Mel forgetting to keep the conversation going to keep the coyotes back, and me listening too intently to think about topics to discuss. I knew I'd heard something behind us. I hadn't noticed it at first, or maybe it hadn't been there at first, but after we stopped I could make out the faint sound of footsteps on dirt that stopped almost as soon as we did, and picked up, or so I thought, as soon as we had. I'd also heard a strange lapping sound just after we started walking again, like something licking the urine off the dirt road. When the farmhouse came into view, the relief between us was palpable. We had both been too preoccupied with the growing number of eyes on either side of the road that we hadn't noticed the light I'd seen from the road had shut off. It was a small house, but I hadn't expected much more than what it was given the location. If it had 4 walls and a roof, I would have been happy, but from the outside I would have guessed that it had at least a few bedrooms, and behind it stood a structure that looked like it may be a detached garage or large shed of some sort. We approached the house, and I was just about to walk up the wooden porch steps when Melanie grabbed my hand. Hold on. I turned to look at her. Her eyes were wide and the pupils were so dilated from the darkness they were nearly black. What's wrong? Do you think this is a good idea? I rolled my eyes. If it wasn't, you could have said something 20 minutes ago. I know, I mean... She paused for a second. Do you think these people will help us? We're strangers in the middle of nowhere, and it's the middle of the night. I shrugged. I think the worst that can happen is they'll tell us to leave. They'll probably answer the door with a shotgun in hand, but who wouldn't? Melanie nodded, and I saw her throat work up and down in a dry, nervous swallow. I walked up the few steps, the wood creaking beneath my feet, leaving Melanie at the bottom. I held up my fist and rapped 3 times on the storm door. We waited, listening intently for sounds inside the house, but heard nothing. Instead, I heard what sounded like the soft, padded feet of a coyote in the dirt behind us, but I brushed that away. They were known for being incredibly quiet. That thought didn't make me feel much better. I opened the storm door and knocked again, this time on the wooden door. The sound carried far better, but again we heard nothing but silence. "I think we should go," Melanie said. "Something isn't right." The knot in my stomach agreed, and I turned to leave just as the door opened. "Who's there?" a man's voice said. He hadn't turned the light on in the house, so when I turned back around, all I could see was a silhouette in the dark, illuminated only by the ambient glow of Melanie's flashlight that was pointed directly at my back. "I'm sorry to bother you, sir," I said. "My name is Matthew Howell, and this is my wife, Melanie. Our car died down the road, and we were hoping you could give us a jump." "No," the man said under his breath. "No, no, 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 no." "Sorry," I said, thinking I misheard him. "Sorry, no, we cannot jump your car tonight. It'll have to wait until morning." "Sir, I'm sorry to impose, but we really can't." A twig snapped behind me, very quiet, but clear nonetheless. "Please come inside," the man said. "You'll stay here tonight." I turned to look at Melanie, who was already walking up the steps. The man opened the door wider to let us in and clicked on a light in the hallway, bathing us in a glow that immediately made me feel better. The farmhouse looked on the inside just as I would have guessed. It was modestly furnished with what looked like handcrafted furniture. Paintings of flowers and landscapes adorned striped wallpaper covered walls that looked like they were most recently renovated in the 70s, and faded area rugs covered wood floors that creaked beneath our feet, even with the slightest weight. The man stood before me now just looked like the kind of person who would live in a house like this. He had thin white hair and a large beard with yellow tobacco stains around his mouth, and he wore a set of beige long johns under a pair of pants held up with suspenders, the outfit of a man who had been disturbed in his bed. I guessed he was somewhere in his 60s, still reasonably muscular from working on the farm, but well past his prime and settling into the atrophy of old age. He had been holding a shotgun in one hand and just then put it down and leaned it up against the doorframe. The man turned and called to someone inside the house. "Ma, put a kettle on, would you? We've got 2 here for the night." "Really," I said, "I don't think we can." "I insist," the man said, turning back to me. "The roads aren't safe at night. It's too easy to get turned around." "Yeah, I can see that," I admitted. "I thought we were doing well until we saw that sign for the highway back there." The man looked at me, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something in his eyes, but before I could make out what it was gone. "The sign," was all he said, and gave an understanding nod. "Do you have a restroom I could use?" Melanie asked, cutting in. "Yes, down the hall and..." The man stopped when he saw her, and again there was something in his expression I didn't like, but again I couldn't make it out before it was gone. "To the right," he finished. Melanie thanked him and made her way to the bathroom. "We'll be just around the corner in the kitchen," the man told her. He turned and led me around the corner where I now heard someone else bustling about, presumably putting a kettle on. "My name is Arthur," the man said, sitting down at the kitchen table. "This here is Ruthie," he said, gesturing to a small woman in a white nightgown who was just then lighting the gas stove. Ruthie turned around and offered me a smile. "Hello," she said. "Did I hear your name is Matthew?" I nodded. "Yes, and my wife's name is Melanie." "They're in the family way," Arthur told Ruthie. "Oh dear," Ruthie said pleasantly. "How exciting. How far along is she?" "Not the word I'd use," Arthur said under his breath. 7 months, I told her. 7 months, she exclaimed, beaming. "And where is she now?" She's in the restroom, I said. Oh, I've got some things for her. Let me run and get them, Ruthie said pleasantly, then disappeared around the corner. Arthur and I sat in silence for a moment. Then I said, Are you sure you can't just give us a jump, or do you have a phone I could use? He shook his head. Sorry, but no. Ruthie and I don't go out after dark, and we haven't had use for a phone in 20 years or more. We'll be happy to give you a ride back to your car and get you on your way as soon as the sun's up. What if we... Listen, Arthur said seriously, leaning forward. He again wore the expression I'd seen earlier. It was one I didn't understand, but looking back at it now, I think my father, who had served in Desert Storm and had seen the expression worn by men as they stood on the other side of a loaded gun, but were determined to show courage in the face of fear, would have picked it up in an instant. You were with your lady the whole time, right? Ever since the car broke down, yeah, I said, and even before that, we've been elbow to elbow for just about every second for the past 2 days. Alright, good. He leaned back in his chair. That's good. What's this about? I asked, and perhaps he would have told me then, although looking back I doubted that he could have, not then, but the tea kettle began to whistle and Ruthie returned quickly to shut it off and poured the contents into full mugs. Melanie came round the corner and took a seat next to me. Ruthie asked us if we took cream or sugar in our tea, which neither of us did. Then she brought mugs over with chamomile tea bags steeping in each of them and took a seat next to Arthur. We have a guest bedroom at the end of the hall you can use until the morning, Ruthie said. I'm glad you found your way here safely. Yeah, Melanie said, bobbing her tea bag up and down in the water by the string it was attached to. Those coyotes were really giving me the creeps. Coyotes? Ruthie asked. Yeah, Ma, coyotes, Arthur said in a tone that sounded like they'd had the conversation 1,000 times. I gotta chase them away from the chickens at least a few times a week. You know that. She nodded. Yes, I just meant I hadn't seen any tonight was all. Probably because they were all with us, I said. There are about a dozen sets of eyes following us up the road. A dozen, you say? Ruthie asked, surprised. Yeah, that'd make sense, Arthur said. They didn't try to get at you, though, did they? No, Melanie said, taking a small exploratory sip of her tea, then another larger one, satisfied that it wasn't too hot. They stayed off the road. I think one of them was behind us, though, so I don't think they all stayed off the road, I said. Melanie looked at me reproachfully. And when did you plan on telling me? As soon as we didn't have one behind us anymore, I told her, shrugging. They didn't get too close, though, Arthur asked. No, they kept their distance, I told him. I'm pretty sure the closest one was the one behind us, and that was still a ways back, I think. He nodded and sipped his own mug. That's good. Those coyotes are serious business. Do you get many of them out here? Melanie asked. Arthur ran a hand through his thin silver hair. You could say that, I suppose. More than most, but less than some. I think they like the chickens we keep in the back. Not much else to eat around here that isn't burrowed away somewhere, so it's an easy meal if they can get at them before I hear the commotion and fire off a round or two. Melanie shivered. I'm glad I don't have to worry about that sort of thing. Where are you folks from? Arthur asked, sipping at his own mug now. Montana, I said. We have coyotes up our way too, but they mostly stay in the more rural parts, and we don't have chickens or anything to worry about. I found one rooting around in the garbage though when I was a kid. I told everyone I thought I saw a wolf. The boy who cried wolf, Melanie teased, jabbing my side with her elbow. That's Matt, all right. I rolled my eyes and fiddled with my own tea bag. I wasn't one for tea, especially chamomile, because it reminded me of being sick as a kid. My mother swore by her herbal remedies, especially those that came in the form of tea. Are we really staying the night? Melanie asked, turning to me. I looked at Arthur, who gave me a clear, solemn nod. I said, yeah, I guess we are. It's late and Arthur and Ruthie say they have a guest room we can stay in for the night. Are you sure? Melanie asked, turning to Ruthie. It won't be too much trouble. Ruthie waved the idea off like a fly. None at all. We haven't had visitors in 10 years or better, not since the Pruitts came for Christmas. And aside from my boys, you're the first to come to our door in just about as long. Oh, you have children? Melanie asked. Long grown now, Arthur said, nodding and staring into his mug. Twins, Ruthie said, beaming. They're about your age, I'd guess. I've got most of their old clothes and things in my back room if you'd like to take a look before you go to bed. I pulled the chest out of the closet already. Melanie looked at me and I gave her a shrug. Then she returned Ruthie's smile and together they made their way further into the house. You two are lucky, Arthur said when the woman had left. How'd you figure? I asked. When the coyotes are hungry, they'll try to get at just about anything that moves. If you really had as many watching you as you say, you could have been walking to your own graves. I wasn't sure I believed him, but the shiver that crawled down my spine certainly did. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the distant voices of our wives talking about children, and the tick of an old grandfather clock somewhere in the house, when I heard the scream again. It was coming from outside, somewhere close to the house, but it was hard to tell. I sat up in my chair, but Arthur didn't move. Birds, he said flatly. Sorry, I asked. We've got birds out here that sound like that sometimes, he said. Sound like a lady shrieking, or sometimes a child crying, but it's just the birds calling to each other. Birds? He nodded. What kind of birds sound like that? He shrugged. I don't know. I heard them called lyrebirds once. Not sure if that was the name or just a fitting description of the things. Yeah, I said, feeling the name scratch away something on the surface of my brain. A fact buried under the dust and cobwebs in my mind. I've heard of those, I think. They can copy other noises like parrots can, right? I thought they lived in Australia or something. Arthur shrugged again. Couldn't say. I don't even know if that's what they are for certain, but I know that the sound we just heard was one of them birds. I settled back in my seat, feeling better about the scream I'd heard earlier. It would have made sense if it came from the air. That could explain why I wasn't sure where it had come from. That reminds me of something that happened to me as a kid. Nothing like crying wolf, but it was an important lesson, I think, Arthur said, his words careful somehow. I took a sip of the tea between my palms, not because I wanted it, but because it felt impolite to leave the whole mug full. You ever heard of a... Arthur searched for the word. A brood parasite? I think that's what they call it. I shook my head. It's a kind of bird that leaves its eggs in another bird's nest. Sometimes it'll push the other eggs out, but usually it just leaves their egg there for the other bird to care for. I heard about these when I was a little boy, maybe 8 or so, and I found a robin's nest with a bunch of little blue eggs and one single black and white speckled one. I thought I'd found something really special, so every day that spring I would climb that tree to see if it had hatched. A couple weeks went by and eventually the egg hatched. It was the first one, and I was so excited to see the little black chick inside. Not long after, the others hatched, and each one of them was a little robin that looked nothing like this blackbird, which was now twice the size of these other ones. The days went by, and one day, as I was about to climb the tree, I found one of the baby robins lying in the grass. I picked it up and climbed back up the tree to find that of the 4 robins that had started in the tree, there was only one left. And of course, my big black bird that was now far larger than the others. It had started to knock the other birds out of the nest. I put the chick that I had saved in the grass back into the nest, and do you know what that blackbird did? I shook my head. It killed it right before my eyes, tore it apart like it was nothing. I ran to tell my father, and that's when I learned about birds that impose their eggs in others' nests so that the other birds will raise them. I thought that... A voice outside interrupted us. It was a cry that almost sounded like it had words this time, but the words were indistinguishable despite the fact that it sounded like it was coming from right outside the window. Arthur sat bolt upright and turned his head quickly to the window. He stood from his seat and crossed the room with 3 large steps. "I was just telling a story. Leave us be." I couldn't be certain, but I thought I heard something scurry away in the dirt. "What was that?" I asked, trying not to sound as nervous as I now felt. "Them damn coyotes," Arthur said. "I thought you said the cries were the birds," I said. "Them too," Arthur said, his tone coming off more annoyed than anything, although there was something else as well. "The coyotes get curious and the birds get agitated, and before I know it, the house is the busiest place in all of New Mexico." He walked around the house and I heard the doorknob shake. Was he checking the lock? Then he returned. "I think it's best if we call it a night. Ruthie'll be up early to make you all breakfast, but feel free to sleep in as late as you'd like. In the morning, we'll take the truck down to the road and I'll jump it for you, and you'll be on your way." I took another gulp of the tea, trying to get the mug down at least halfway, and agreed. Melanie was totally out by the time I entered the room. She couldn't have been there long, but I saw that Ruthie had her set up nicely with a nest of pillows in all the right places, and it looked like this might be the first night in weeks that she got a decent night's sleep. I undressed down to my boxers and slid into the bed next to my wife. I was exhausted, but sleep was nowhere to be found, and so I lay there staring up at the ceiling, wondering about the decisions that had led us here. There had been a knot growing in the pit of my stomach ever since we parked the car, and it had only tightened since we'd arrived at the farmhouse. Arthur and Ruthie were nice enough, but there was something they weren't telling us. If I were watching the night play out like a movie, I imagined that the twist would be that they were secretly plotting our demise, or that the screaming sounds I'd been hearing were those of their victims chained up in the large garage behind the house. But I didn't think so. It wasn't that I didn't think they were capable. I'd only just met them and had no idea what they were actually capable of. It was more that it just didn't seem to fit. It was the look on Arthur's face when he asked me if I'd been with Melanie the whole time we'd stopped there. It was the undertone in his voice when he told whatever was outside that he was just telling me a story. It was the story itself. What was that exactly? Just an elderly man retelling a memory from his childhood? Or was it something else? A cry echoed outside the window. This one sounded like "Ma." It seemed more believable now that it was a bird, because it certainly didn't sound human now that I'd had the chance to hear it without other sound pollution. Not exactly human, anyway. Melanie snorted beside me. The preamble to full-on snore coming in the next few weeks, I was sure. Another scream, this one closer, but from a different direction. The birds were all talking to each other. I sighed and closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, even if it was just for a couple of hours. The house was cold, probably from poor insulation, and the single-pane windows. I pulled the sheets up and turned to my side, pulling my knees up to my chest for a little extra warmth. I was nearly asleep when I heard claws scratch the wall outside the house, and my eyes flew open. Was that the coyotes again? Did coyotes do that? I wasn't sure. I sat up and listened for more, knowing full well that in the morning I would feel silly for being as scared as I was, but also knowing that the night has a way of making monsters come out, even if they are just the ones in your head. A scream broke through the silence, this one incredibly loud and right outside the window. I looked over at Melanie, expecting her to be as awake as I was, but she only stirred. I got out of bed and crossed the room, throwing the curtains open, hoping to scare away whatever was sitting outside. I hadn't expected to see a face on the other side of the glass. I stumbled backward, tripping on my own feet and falling onto the wooden floor with a sharp thud. From where I lay, I could see nothing but moonlight coming through the cracks in the curtain, and for that I was thankful. Had the face been that of Arthur, I would have at least understood, despite how sick it would have made me feel. But the face I saw through the glass wasn't Arthur or Ruthie. I don't think it was even human. Just like the sound of screaming I had heard through the wall, it was close to being human, but still not quite right. The eyes were too big and far apart, and the mouth too wide, the nose too flat. Could it have been my reflection? The logical part of my mind liked that answer. It liked it a lot. I stood up cautiously, fearful that the face would still be there, peering at me through the glass. But as I stood, I saw that that wasn't the case. I could see myself in the glass just well enough to convince myself that that's what I had seen. Scared of my own reflection, had Melanie been awake, there's no way I would ever live this one down. But despite the noises I had just made, she still lay soundly asleep. I closed the curtains again, taking care to ensure that not a sliver of moonlight came through them, then lay back down next to my wife. I didn't sleep much that night. I don't think I would have regardless, given the intermittent screams and cries coming from just outside my bedroom window, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see the image of the face that was looking back at me through the glass. A circus funhouse image of a human face, burned into my retinas like the flash of a camera lens. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because I opened my eyes to find the rods of sunlight cast from the window into the bedroom. Melanie was stirring, which meant soon she would be awake and in the bathroom. I checked my phone, still no service, but it reported the time to be just before 6. I got out of bed and got dressed, determined to get out of there as soon as Melanie was ready. The image from the night before had dulled by then, and although the memory still gave me the creeps, the logical part of my brain had daylight on its side, and by the end of breakfast I would have myself convinced that it had been my reflection in the glass. I quietly opened the door and stepped out of the bedroom. The scent of coffee wafted through the air, although I didn't hear anyone moving around the house just yet. I made my way to the kitchen, expecting to find either Arthur or Ruthie sitting down at the table, enjoying a mug, or at least a full pot of coffee with a timer that had gone off. Instead, I found 2 empty mugs of coffee and a half pot sitting on the burner. I didn't have time to wonder where they had gotten off to, because I heard Ruthie's voice in the yard calling to Arthur. I peeked out of the window to see Arthur's truck backing up towards the large garage. Was it just the one? She called to him over the sound of the truck's engine. Arthur turned off the truck, stepped out of the driver's seat, and came around to the bed where he had 2 large iron poles sticking out over the back. No, it was 2 this time, he said. Got a 1-mile one and a half-mile one now. He dropped the tailgate of the truck and the 2 metal poles clattered loudly. They're getting more clever, Ruth, Arthur said, hoisting the large street signs out of the back of the truck and carrying them to the shed. It was only the one sign with the Pruitts, and I don't even know where they are getting these things. Probably off some stretch of the road around here. We're going to have to do something about it, sooner or... Don't you say such a thing, Ruthie said sharply. I know, Arthur said, putting his hands up. I'm sorry, I just don't like cleaning up their messes is all. We'll take it up with them, Ruthie said. He's your... Arthur looked up fiercely at her, and she didn't finish her sentence. He may be yours, but he ain't mine, he growled. Mine's out under the apple tree. The couple walked around towards the door, and I quickly slipped back to the bedroom. Melanie was sitting up. "Hey Matt, what time is it?" "I don't know," I said. "Somewhere around 6, I think. We should get going though." Melanie stretched. "Yeah," she said through a wide yawn. "That's probably a good idea. How'd you sleep?" "I slept great," I lied, knowing that the truth would surely cause questions that I'd rather not answer just then. "Me too," she said, scratching the back of her head. "Best night's sleep I've had since I got pregnant. Let me pee, then I'll get dressed and we can go." I agreed, trying not to sound too eager, with the rising sense of unease filling my gut. She got out of bed, donned a robe that I assumed Ruthie had given her the night before, and padded her way to the guest bathroom across the hall. Arthur had gotten up early this morning to collect the street signs we had seen the night before. That much was obvious. What wasn't so obvious was why. Who had put them there? The elderly couple returned from outside just as Mel was coming back from the bathroom. "Oh," Ruthie exclaimed. "I didn't think you two would be up for at least another hour or so. Let me get breakfast on." "That's alright," I said. "We really should get back on the road anyway." "I have coffee on already, so at least take a cup to go with a couple of blueberry muffins I made the night before last." I opened my mouth to politely decline, but Mel beat me to it. "I don't think I can look at blueberry right now," she said, followed by a dry heave. The woman nodded knowingly. "Just fine then. How about you?" I shook my head. "I'm not much of a breakfast person," I told her. "Alright," Ruthie said, drawing the word out like she was talking to children. "But if you leave this house hungry, it's your own fault." She went into the kitchen, presumably to get her own breakfast started, and Melanie went back to the bedroom to collect her things, but Arthur lingered with me in the hallway. "Your wife get morning sickness a lot?" he asked after a silence that felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of Ruthie's movements in the kitchen. "She did at first," I told him. "This is the first time in a while though. The road trip is probably taking a toll, I think." Arthur nodded slowly. "Yeah, probably." Then, after another long pause, "You said you were with her the whole time, right? Ever since your car broke down?" "Yeah," I said slowly. "Why?" He shook his head as if that told me all I needed to know. "Alright, Matt," Mel said, opening the door behind me. "I'm ready when you are." "I'll get my keys," Arthur said. The ride back to the car was quiet and uneventful. Mel waited in the passenger seat, resuming her quest for a comfortable position, while I popped the hood and went to work connecting the two batteries to each other to start the car. To my relief, the car started on the second try. "Thank you for everything," I told Arthur as I slammed the hood of the car down. "Last night would have been much worse if it wasn't for you and your wife." I offered my hand out for him to shake, which he took with the leathery grip of a man who had spent his whole life working with his hands. There was another look in his eye then, as we stood on the shoulder of the road shaking hands, that told me there was more that he wanted to say, but something even then was holding him back. We loosened our grip, and just before I could turn away, Arthur stopped me. "Hold 1 minute," he said. "I've got something for you from Ruthie." He went to the cab of his truck and returned with a dilapidated cardboard box. "Some clothes for your little one. It ain't much, but we won't get any use out of them." I took the box and thanked him, doubting that we'd ever use them, but feeling that if I refused he would insist and I would still leave with the box. "Thanks, Arthur," I said. "One more thing," he said, before I could turn around. His voice got quiet when he spoke, just above a whisper and far too quiet for anyone other than the two of us to hear. I looked up at him and frowned, searching his face for the joke that wasn't there, nodded uneasily, then said goodbye. Arthur stood in the middle of the road, waving broadly at us from the rearview mirror as his silhouette disappeared into the dust kicked up by our tires. I never thought I'd return to Gompa's farm, yet alone so quickly, but circumstances change. and with them expectations. It took me nearly a whole day to find the road the signs had led us down, and by then it was dusk and I returned back to my hotel so as not to be out after dark. Melanie stayed home this time. Her condition had gotten significantly worse since our road trip, and she had been prescribed bed rest by the OBGYN, among other things, until she was ready to deliver. Her mother hadn't been happy with me flying out to New Mexico, even with the lie we told her about it being a work trip, but her mother's chagrin was a small price to pay for what I was hoping to get out of a reunion with Arthur and Ruthie. I drove up the dirt road following the only street sign now for Gompa's farm, hoping to find an answer to something that had happened to us not long after returning home. I parked my car next to Arthur's pickup truck and stepped out. I waited for a moment, wondering if I would hear the sound of the birds carrying human-like screams along the air. To my relief, I heard nothing at all. I walked around to the front of the house, prepared to knock as I had mere weeks before, but found that I didn't need to. The door to the farmhouse was open. Dirt coated the entrance floor, suggesting that it had been open for a while. Cautiously, remembering the face I had seen in the window, but feeling the bravery given to me by the daylight, I called out into the house. "Hello?" I called. "Arthur? Ruthie?" No reply. I stepped into the house, noting first that the shotgun Arthur had answered the door with was no longer propped against the wall in the corner by the door. "Hello?" I called again. "Is anyone there?" I explored the house carefully, worried that if I surprised anyone too much that I would find my skull full of buckshot, but sensing that I was totally alone. The kitchen was clean, with only a couple of plates in the sink with dried on food that could have been there from the night before, or perhaps longer. The bedroom where Mel and I had stayed looked exactly like we had left it. I called out again as I headed up the stairs towards the part of the house I hadn't been. There were 3 doors down the hallway from the top of the stairs. I chose the first and opened it. It was a young boy's room, a time capsule from decades ago. The boy who had once dwelt here must have been 6 or so, judging by the toys, books and decorations that filled the space. Above the bed, in large block letters, was the name Jonathan. The next room was a bathroom adorned with yellow daisies over most of the surfaces. I opened the door to the final room and was struck by 2 things simultaneously. First was the body of Ruthie Gompa laying in the bed. She wore a nightgown and looked as if she had gone peacefully in her sleep. Second was the putrid odour that had somehow not completely filled the house, possibly because the door had been left open. It was clear that she had been dead for at least a few days, perhaps not long after Mel and I had left. But there was still no sign of Arthur. I went downstairs and out the front door, glad to be rid of the smell that followed me after I opened the door. I walked around the side of the house, calling Arthur's name and getting nothing in return. I checked inside the large shed and found the road signs that Mel and I had seen driving down the road that night, along with a third that said freeway entrance left 1 mile, just like the first sign we had seen. I turned the flashlight on my phone on and held it up to get a better look at the shed. There was some old farm equipment scattered around the area, but what caught my attention was toward the back. I took a few more steps to get a better look and found a corner of the space had been decorated like a bedroom. There was an old bed with a rusty frame and a torn mattress set up in the corner, along with a collection of what appeared to be chew toys sprinkled around. Above the bed, in block letters similar to the boy's bedroom I had seen in the house, was the name Christopher. I took a few more curious steps forward to get a better look at the makeshift living space, then felt something at my feet. I stooped to pick up the item buried in the dirt and found part of a chain. As I picked it up, the chain emerged from its resting place in the ground, and as I pulled it up, I found that it was connected to a large metal pole posted near the bed. I followed the chain on the other side, and found at the end part of a broken shackle. I dropped the chain, letting it tinkle to the ground, and left as quickly as I could. If Arthur was here, I know that this was the last place he would want me to be. I examined the rest of the farmyard, wondering where, if at all, I would find Arthur, and my eyes landed on a shape beneath a tree in the distance. I could hear Arthur's words from the weeks before, mine's under the apple tree, and wondered if this was the tree he had spoken of. As I drew closer, the shape beneath the tree became clearer, and I recognized it as the man I sought. "Arthur," I called, beginning to jog now. "Arthur, I really need to—" I stopped. It was Arthur, but he wouldn't be answering any of my questions. The top of his skull was missing, and his body was slumped against the trunk of the tree, hunched over the barrel of the shotgun that still rested in his mouth. His body was covered in bite marks and scratches that looked like perhaps he had given himself the least painful death presented to him. Besides Arthur's body stood a wooden cross with the name Jonathan carved into the horizontal piece. He had said his was under the apple tree. He had meant his son. Which begged the question I had come with that now seemed wouldn't be answered. What happened to the other boy? A piece of paper stuck out between Arthur's fingertips. I stooped down and grabbed it, hoping perhaps a suicide note would give me at least part of the answer I had come for. It wasn't a note, however, but a photograph. One that had to be 25 years old or so. A younger-looking Arthur smiled back at me, holding a 5-year-old at his hip, who wore a wide grin and a pair of overalls just like his father. Next to them stood a younger Ruthie, who stood next to another child who was far larger than the first and whose face had been scratched out. My stomach twisted in knots as I looked down at the second boy. The shirt he wore was one that had been given to us in the box of old clothes, but despite the clothes, it was clear to see that there was still something off about him. His legs and arms weren't quite right, his fingers too long, his torso too thin. It was the body that belonged to the face I had seen when we had spent the night and I had opened the curtain. A creature meant to seem human, but had just missed the mark. I put the photograph back into Arthur's dead hand and walked back towards my car. Melanie hadn't been right ever since we left that night. She had gotten sicker and sicker by the day. Her OBGYN had insisted that we come in to make sure everything was alright, and that was when we discovered it. Melanie was pregnant with twins. The doctor told us that it was possible, however rare, to miss a child on the ultrasound, but I knew that wasn't what it was. The pieces all started to fall together for me over the next few days, which led me to take a flight back out to New Mexico in the hopes that Arthur or Ruthie could help us. When we had left that day, Arthur had told me something that I hadn't taken very seriously then. He said, if she has two, take the little one and run. Those words echoed in my head when we went through the box of clothes Ruthie had given us. We saw that the baby clothes came mostly in pairs, which made sense because we knew that the couple had twin boys. But when we noticed that there was always a far larger outfit than the other, I began to wonder why Arthur had told me to take the little one and run. What had happened to his little one? Furthermore, why had he been so concerned about my leaving Melanie alone that night? He had asked me at least twice to make sure, as if it were vitally important, and I had shrugged it off, not realizing then that I had left her alone that night, just once, when I jogged out to get a better view of the street sign, just before I heard her scream. She doesn't remember it, but I believe that moment is when that thing, Christopher, got to her. Arthur had warned me about the birds that lay their eggs in another bird's nest. He had even gone as far as to call the things making the terrible noises birds, and it hadn't clicked. He had been trying to warn us about Christopher and however many others like him there were living there at the farm, about the dozen or so pairs of eyes that had followed us up to the trail of the house. Those things didn't like that and stopped him. They had cried out in the dark outside the window as they listened to him tell me the story about the brood parasite birds and the birds who mimic the sounds of children crying. They didn't like it because by then they had laid their egg, leaving nothing but a faint white scar encircling her navel that was nearly completely gone now, and they didn't want us to know. I wondered if Arthur had killed Christopher before taking his own life. The wounds on his body told the story of a man who had fought hard against a wild animal, and I could only imagine it had been the creature who had been born from his wife's womb alongside his son. He had told me that the blackbird had ripped the other bird to pieces when he was a boy, and I couldn't help but think that the same thing had happened to his son at the hand of the other. If that were true, the only thing that could stand between Arthur and a redemption for his son was Ruthie, and with her gone, that was all he had left to do. I could see him discovering her death and setting out to avenge the death of his only son after all these years, only to find that the fight was one he could no longer win. He had taken his gun outside and had searched for the beast, eventually finding him and perhaps killing him, before crawling his way up to where his son lay and turning the gun on himself lest the wounds take his life instead. Or perhaps not. There was no way to be sure, not really. I got back to my car and climbed into the driver's seat. My hand shook as I turned the key and started back down the road. My phone found service for just a moment, and I looked down and saw that I had 3 missed calls, 2 from Mel and 1 from her mother. There was a text message as well that read, "It's happening." I was about to be a father. I stepped on the gas pedal and sped back towards the main road, stopping only for a moment to make the turn at the now defunct sign that read Gompa's Farm. As I made the turn, and the sound of the engine was just low enough, I thought I could hear a cry carried in the air. The sound was almost human. "Ma,"